In my search for Stephen Ramasodi, most of the information I was able to collect came from anti-apartheid organisations and people who were opposed to the National Party government of the 1950s. The Cape Town Family History Society is not a political organisation, so the views expressed are purely my own and not necessarily the Society's. I present this talk not as an attack on that government, but rather as a way of demonstrating to you, fellow genealogists, that the same resources we use to find our white settler or mixed-race families, such as NAIRS, FamilySearch.org, GenDatabase.com, etc., can also be used for researching our black South African families. My talk this afternoon will be in 3 parts. 1. Who is Stephen Ramasodi? 2. Why was I approached to find out about him? 3. What have I found so far? Who is Stephen Ramasodi? In 1955, Stephen Ramasodi was a 16-year-old black schoolboy from Pretoria studying at St. Peter's Secondary School in Rosettenville. He was offered a bursary to attend Kent School in Connecticut. His application for a passport to travel to the United States was rejected by the South African government, and so he was not able to take up this wonderful opportunity that was offered to him. Why was it offered to Stephen in the first place, and why Kent School all the way in the USA? We need to start in the late 1953, when the principal of Kent School, the Reverend John Patterson, and one of the school's trustees, Louis Stone, invited Alan Paton to speak at the school. The pupils had been moved by Alan Paton's 1948 novel, Cry the Beloved Country. He must have made quite an impression on the boys during his visit, as they voted to give the year's chapel offerings and proceeds from their Halloween carnival to the causes patron supported in South Africa. The school was offered a full year's scholarship to an African boy. Alan Paton left it to Father Trevor Huddleston to make the choice of a suitable candidate, and Stephen Ramasodi was the candidate selected by Trevor Huddleston. At this point, it might be a good idea to explain who these people were, as well as saying something about the school. Alan Paton, 1903 to 1988, was a South African writer and anti-apartheid activist. His work includes the novel Cry the Beloved Country, Too Late, The Philanthrope, and, as a church historian, I know his biography of Archbishop Clayton. He was a leader of the Liberal Party and a sincere Christian who said it was his Christian faith that made him an opponent to apartheid. He was also deeply involved in education, in particular the education of black youth in trouble, as he was at one time principal of the Deep Kloof Reformatory. Father Trevor Huddleston, 1913 to 1998, was an Anglican priest and monk. Yes, the Anglican Church also has monks and nuns. Father Trevor belonged to an order called the Community of the Resurrection, based in Mirfield, near Leeds in Yorkshire. Members of this order were called CR Brothers or CR Fathers, and usually placed CR behind their names. The Community of the Resurrection were invited to work in Johannesburg by the Bishop of Johannesburg, and they did most of their work in Sophiatown and later in Soweto. Among the work they did was to set up schools for black and underprivileged pupils in southern Johannesburg. Father Trevor Huddleston came to South Africa in 1948 and was renowned for his fight against the apartheid laws. In 1956, his book entitled Naught for Your Comfort was published, and perhaps it was the opposition to the government expressed in this book that made the CR order decide to move Trevor Huddleston back to England before he was arrested or incarcerated. He became the Bishop of Stepney in London, and in 1978 Archbishop of the province of Indian Ocean, which includes Mauritius and the Seychelles. Kent School is a private co-educational college preparatory boarding school in Kent, Connecticut. In 1955 it was for boys only but became coeducational in 1962. It was established by Frederick Herbert Sill in 1906 and is affiliated with the Episcopal Church of the United States, which is basically the American Anglican Church. The school has a long history as an elite school, not a school for elites, as they put it on their webpage. In a recent YouTube video on private schools in the States, it was ranked 8th in the top 10 private schools. I'd like to show a 2-minute video of the school campus and its students for you to see just how special it is. Although it is a modern video, I'm sure you'll get the idea of just how special it must have been even back in 1955, and how exciting it must have been for Stephen to be offered this bursary.
First time I saw the Kent campus, it was beautiful. That's the first thing I thought.
We're on the Appalachian Trail. It's quite a unique environment.
I didn't want to leave when I came to Kent. It felt like home.
Class sizes are fairly small here. Every little class is like a different family for me.
Just around campus, you really get to know everyone.
The people here are very welcoming. The fact that I can walk into the dining hall and sit anywhere with someone different is amazing.
I've got friends from everywhere, from Egypt, Uganda, England.
I'm sitting here in a classroom with kids from all over the world.
Interesting to see how similar we all are, even though we're all from different places.
That just enhances my experience here.
Being unique here is not something that's frowned upon. It's something that's really celebrated.
Kent really has inspired me to do things that I never thought were really in my comfort zone.
I know football players that are also in the play. My roommate is a diver and she does the musical.
All these opportunities were thrown at me. I just started taking them and I made so many friends in the process. It was great.
There are so many options you can pick, and that's kind of the great thing about Kent.
Honestly, the trickiest part here at Kent is trying to take advantage of everything because there's so much.
I really value the student-teacher relationships here.
You really build close relationships with the teachers.
It's awesome to see how your advisor can also be your coach and also just be someone you go to when you just want to talk to someone.
The teachers at Kent, they're not just teachers. They're dorm parents, coaches, friends.
Teachers challenge you to take harder classes and to challenge yourself in those classes.
I wanted to be challenged. I like to be challenged. And Kent, everyone's on your side. Everyone's going to help you to succeed. They're encouraging you to branch out. They're encouraging you to do better.
I kind of put my feet on the ground here and just decided to run with it and do everything, join clubs and get involved.
Kent isn't all about academics. It's so much more than that.
There's a good balance with time with your friends and playing sports and being involved in extracurricular things.
Everyone has a passion and it's exciting to see that come alive here.
Kent really helped me develop as a person, both academics and socially.
Kent has helped me to grow as a person and a student in more ways than I can say, honestly.
Kent has helped me grow into someone that really wants to get involved in wherever they are.
I love Kent because it gives me the liberty I need to explore my choices.
Kent has given me a confidence because they're going to throw so many things at you and I can handle it.
Kent is the right place for me because I feel like I can be everything that I want to be here.
At Kent, I'm a soccer player and a news editor.
I am a part of the senior council and the captain of the crew. I am the senior prefect and I do musical theater. This is where I grew up. This is where I learned how to be myself. Honestly, I feel like Kent has brought the best out of me.
So why was I approached to find out about Stephen Ramasodi? Recently, a former pupil of Kent School, Larry Gile, he left the school in 1973, was going through the school's old newsletters when he came across an editorial entitled "A Friend We Never Knew" in the November 1955 edition. It tells how Stephen Ramasodi from South Africa would not be joining the school and how he was a friend that they'd never had the opportunity to know. It also included a complete letter from Stephen himself, expressing his disappointment at not being able to come to the school. The editorial states, quote, "The students cannot forget this boy whom they had never really known, and the same was true of Stephen in regard to Kent. It goes on to say, "The following letter reveals Stephen as a warm-hearted, intelligent boy. It's only hope that some goodwill will come out of this unfortunate incident." Stephen's letter, quoted in the editorial, expressed his own sadness as he writes, "I hope to see America in my life because it has been ever in my mind. I was so delighted when Father Huddleston told me about the bursary that I did not believe it, but when the disappointment came, I did not know what to do." He ends his letter, as only a 16-year-old can, by saying, "I'm very much interested in jazz, magazine reading, and the people in the United States, and I ask Father to send me any discarded magazines about jazz and everything." Such a poignant letter made Larry Gill keen to find out about what happened to Stephen from that point on. He began by approaching the Community of the Resurrection to see if they had any papers dealing with Father Huddleston and this issue. He managed to trace some letters between Alan Paton and Trevor Huddleston, where Stephen Ramasodi and the possible application rejection were mentioned. But all were around 1955, nothing about what he did after school and his career as an adult. One of the current CR fathers, Father Nicholas Stebbing, mentioned in his search for Stephen to Michael Bester. Michael was a church warden at St. Paul's Rondebosch when I was there. He later was ordained and is at present reading for his doctorate at Oxford. He is an oblate of the CR order. Oblates of the CR Order of the Community of the Resurrection are, to quote the CR webpage, men who accept a vocation to celibacy and live it out wherever they are, either working or in retirement. Some are priests, some are laymen, but all wish to live by the chrism of the CR and deepen their life of prayer with God. Michael remembered that I did genealogy and how I found living members of the Tredegar family when he was working on the Black River Cemetery. So he sent me the details that were known at that point and suggested it might be an interesting project. I also thought so, as I had never had to search for a black South African family, and thus it would be a good exercise for me to do. I emailed Michael, Father Stebbing, and Larry Gill, saying I was willing to do this research. Larry was quite excited that someone in South Africa was willing to do the research, and he felt that genealogical research was most probably the way to go. So part 3, what have I found so far, and how did I go about finding it? I first read through all the documents Father Stebbing and Larry Gill had sent me. There were mainly letters between Alan Paton and Trevor Huddleston, and a few between the government and Father Huddleston. The earliest was about April 1955, and the last in 1956, when Trevor had been recalled to England. Larry had also found a few mentions of the incident in the New York Times, the Time magazine, and Life magazine, but once again nothing beyond the mid-1950s. These documents and letters mention that he was 16-year-old in 1955, so he must have been born about 1938-1940. That means he would be 83 to 85 years old today. I presume, too, that he might have died. My first search was on gendatabase.com, as they have information from the National Population Register, so his death and marriage would be listed there. I entered Stephen Ramasodi, and among the many that came up, only one was born in the 1938 to 1940 period. This was Stephen Gustav Lulu Ramasodi, and there were 4 entries: his birth, marriage, 2004 voters' roll, and his death. Screenshots of these are too long to incorporate on a slide, so I captured them as text with a copy and paste. However, I was not certain if this was the right Stephen Ramasodi that we were looking for. Firstly, his first name. Nowhere is Stephen's name given as Stephen Gustav Lulu, but I suppose this is not unusual. Secondly, however, Gustav looked very Germanic, so perhaps this man was baptized as a Lutheran. Lutheran and Moravian missionaries were quite active in the Northwest Province area. However, Stephen's family were very actively Anglican, according to the letters from Huddleston and Peyton. What I needed was a specific date of birth for Stephen Ramasodi. I was looking for it, and if that matched the date of birth of Stephen Gustav Lulu Ramasodi, then we were on to a winner. But where was I going to get Stephen's date of birth? From Larry Gill's article, I had the name of his father, Peter. If Stephen Gustav Lulu Ramasodi had a death notice with his parents' names on it, I might succeed. But Stephen Gustav Lulu Ramasodi died in 2000, and in the Pretoria archives the estate files did not go that modern. But I looked on NAIRS, N-A-A-I-R-S, where, to my surprise, Stephen Ramasodi appeared as SAB, NTS, reference 968/301, Passport, Stephen Ramasodi, 1955. This is a specific file from the Department of Native Affairs. NTS equals Secretary of Native Affairs. This file dealt with the passport application for Stephen. I ordered a copy of this file through the services offered by the Genealogical Society of Southern Africa. It took a few weeks, but it finally arrived, and what an interesting document it turned out to be. It showed how Stephen Ramasodi's application for a passport was shifted around from pillar to post, or department to department. This was confirmed in Trevor Huddleston's book, Naught for Your Comfort, where he tells the reader that each Friday, when they phoned the department, they were told that the matter was being dealt with and they must phone again the next Friday. Until finally the principal of St. Peter's Secondary School, where Stephen was a pupil, sent a telegram to the Minister of Native Affairs. It was dated 9th of July 1955 and had an urgent stamp on it. It was addressed to the Minister, who was Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, at 850 Government Avenue, Pretoria. It read, Passport Ramasodi refers, stop. 3 months delay and all efforts unavailing, stop. Must inform United States and world press your non-cooperation unless immediate action. Stern, Priory, Rosettenville, Johannesburg. Michael Stern was the principal of St. Peter's Secondary School in Rosettenville, but the South African government weren't fooled. They knew it was really from Father Huddleston. The government was quick to reply in a letter dated 13th of July 1955. It started courteously by saying passports were issued by the Department of the Interior, and the Department of Native Affairs only intervened when asked courteously to do so because of a long delay. Then the letter turned a bit nasty as it continued. The Minister, Dr. Verwoerd, has instructed me to state, however, that he will not be intimidated into giving aid by a discourteous telegram such as yours containing threats of attempted pressure through United States and world press. In fact, when crude methods are adopted, presumably by a clergyman, suspicion is raised that one may be dealing with agitators, and that most careful scrutiny of the application by the department concerned may be more justified. The telegram was sent by Michael Stern. Now, Michael Alexander Stern, OBE, 1922 to 2002, after serving as principal at St. Peter's Rosettenville until it was closed as a school for black pupils, as it was a black spot in southern Johannesburg. He then became the headmaster of the new whites-only school which took its place, St. Martin's School, Rosettenville. He stayed for 5 years and then moved to Mababane to found the Waterford Kumhlaba United World College, a multiracial school in opposition to the South African apartheid policies. What was the process for a black person to get a passport to go to the United States? Well, besides the normal processes through the Department of the Interior, the South African police clearance, a black person would be required to obtain permission from the Department of Native Affairs. The earliest letter in the file was dated 5th of May 1955 and was a South African police clearance for Stephen to visit the United States. I was rather surprised that the police objected to his application. not on security grounds, but on educational grounds. The report was stamped secret and was from a Major J. Joubert. It was in Afrikaans, and my Afrikaans is not good enough to translate it, but Google Translate did it for me. So if it sounds a bit stilted, that's why. It stated, "After careful consideration, this application is not recommended by this department due to circumstances directly applicable to this case. The applicant has only passed Standard 7 examinations, and in my opinion there are sufficient facilities available in the Union of South Africa to meet all his requirements." Finally, a handwritten note on the memo said, quote, "Presuming that the applicant is approximately 14 years old and is not going abroad for any bona fide purposes." This response rather shocked me. What right had a policeman like Major Joubert to decide on educational ability or facilities being adequate or not? Yet if Stephen was going to be a threat to South Africa or South Africans, this was acceptable. But that was not the reason given in the note. The Department of Native Affairs then got involved. A report was requested from the Native Commissioner in Pietersburg, now Polokwane. Mr. C.J. Davis sent a report dated the 12th of July 1955, which briefly reported that it was difficult to say anything about his character because Stephen was at school in Johannesburg. His father, Philip Eustace Ramasodi, not Peter as the article by Larry Gill stated, was the principal of J.J. de Jong Primary School in Attridgeville, Pretoria. According to the principal of the St. Peter's Secondary School where Stephen was attending, he was of good character. Stephen's father could not say how long the proposed visit would last. He believes it could be for 1 year or several years, depending on results, and had given his consent for him to go to the USA. He is 16 years old and is now in Form 3. According to the principal, he is one of the more promising pupils. The Native Commissioner could not really find out anything about the training he was going to receive in the USA. However, it would appear as if he would not differ from the type of training available in the Union, and the report concluded that in light of the applicant's youth and the fact that he cannot obtain any special training due to his still limited development, and can also enjoy the same training here, the Native Commissioner recommended that the application be refused. With these two rejections, the Department of the Interior, who issues passports, decided to reject Stephen's application and informed him and the St. Peter's School of this fact on the 23rd of July 1955. While all this was going on, Louis Stone, a trustee of Kent School, wrote to the Prime Minister, Mr. J.C. Stradham, asking him to expedite the issue of a passport. It was a 2-page letter wherein he asked for the Prime Minister to intercede to ensure Stephen got his passport. He spoke of Stephen getting, quote, a full fellowship, study, travel and living paid for by Kent School. He pointed out that Kent School, like the South African government, did not want the situation with Stephen to bring bad publicity to either the school or the country. The school had 300 pupils, and at that point had only 3 Negro students, as they were known in those days, and they hoped that having Stephen there would open the school up to more black students, and the refusal might cause the school to be criticized for the small number of black students at the school at that time. Therefore, it was advantageous for both parties to grant the passport. He pointed out that it was not the school, but the US and the UK press that had made Stephen a cause célèbre. He was asking the Prime Minister to assist to avoid further adverse publicity. The private secretary to the Prime Minister, Mr. J.P. Nell, responded to Louis Stone by saying that the Prime Minister had given full consideration to Louis Stone's request, but in his considered opinion, he could not agree to Stone's request. By far the most interesting letter in the file was a copy of a letter, copy undated, sent to Dr. Jack Holloway, the South African ambassador in Washington, from 6 prominent Americans. It was written after the refusal of the passport was announced and said, quote, "We cannot believe that such a refusal is in the best interest of either of South Africa or of the United States of America." They continued, "We believe that parents have the right to decide on the future of their children, and it is not the function of the state in any but totalitarian countries." They ended the letter by asking the ambassador to make it clear to the officials back in South Africa that their, quote, "sense of disappointment, and we would urge that if the good name of South Africa is not to suffer, that this decision be rescinded and the passport granted without delay." The letter was signed by Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, F.F. Patterson, Clarence Peckett, the Reverend Reinhold Niebuhr, Willard Townsend, Philip Randolph, and the Reverend Donald Barrington. Perhaps well known in the 1950s, but today I think I need to briefly give you their backgrounds. Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1884 to 1962. This is, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the First Lady of the United States as wife of the President, but also was an American political figure, diplomat, pacifist, and activist. Her husband, whose 4 terms in office of President were from 1933 to 1945. She served as the United States delegate to the United Nations General Assembly from 1945 to 1952. And in 1948 she was given a standing ovation by the Assembly upon the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. President Harry S. Truman later called her the First Lady of the World, in tribute to her human rights achievements. Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., 1908-1972, was an American Baptist pastor and politician who represented the Harlem neighborhood of New York City in the United States House of Representatives from 1945 until 1971. He was the first African American to be elected to Congress from New York State. Powell was a powerful national politician of the Democratic Party and served as a national spokesman on civil rights and social issues. He also urged the United States President to support the emerging nations in Africa and Asia as they gained independence after colonialism. Clarence Evan Pickett. Clarence, 1884 to 1965. He was an American religious leader, notably 20th century Quaker, and head of the non-governmental Humanitarian Relief Agency. Frederick Douglass Patterson, 1901-1988, was an American academic administrator, the president of what is now Tuskegee University, and founder of the United Negro College Fund. Carl Paul Reinhold Niebuhr, 1892-1971, was an American Reformed theologian, ethicist, commentator on politics and public affairs, and a professor at the Union Theological Seminary for more than 30 years. Niebuhr was one of America's leading public intellectuals for several decades of the 20th century and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. Willard Saxby Townsend, 1895 to 1957, was an African-American labor leader. He worked to improve the working condition of African-American baggage handlers in the railway terminals. Asa Philip Randolph, 1889-1979, was also an American labor unionist and civil rights activist. His continuous agitation with the support of fellow labor right activists against racial unfair labor practices eventually helped President Roosevelt to issue an executive order in 1941 banning discrimination in the defense industries during the Second World War. Donald Sanzotho Harrington was an American politician and religious leader. He was a minister of the New York Unitarian Universalist Church and state chairman of the Liberal Party of New York. Larry Gill assures me that all these persons were highly regarded in the USA. And then finally, the ambassador in Washington, Jack Holloway, 1890 to 1979. I could find no picture of Mr. Holloway, so I've included a picture of the Prime Minister, C.J. Stradham. Holloway was South Africa's ambassador at the time. He had served as Secretary of Finance from 1937 to 1950. He went on to become the South African ambassador to the United States in 1954 and High Commissioner to Britain in 1957. He responded to the letter and forwarded it to the government back in South Africa. He said he'd received numerous correspondence, quote, assuming that the South African government had been wrong in its decision. However, he felt that the letter writers had not given sufficient weight to the effect on Stephen himself. Quote, I wonder whether critics of South Africa in this matter have thought of the effect of uprooting a boy from his environment at the immature age, training him according to the needs of a totally different environment, and then, after his formative years, subject him to the stresses and strains of making a living in his old environment, from which he has in the meantime become completely divorced. Back in Pretoria, the Minister of Native Affairs at that time, Hendrik Verwoerd, instructed his department to forward to the Department of External Affairs a copy of the Prime Minister's response, as given in Parliament and reported in Hansard's page 1955, pages 167 to 169. I'm still hoping to look these up and to see what the opposition MPs had to say in response to the passport denial. We've already seen the American response, but there's also articles in the New York Times, Life magazine, Time magazine. Life magazine had a picture of Father Reverend Trevor Huddleston with Stephen Ramasodi. That's the only picture of him that I've found. In South Africa, there was a report in the Sunday Times of the 17th of July 1955 criticising the government's action. The government's decision was also criticised by numerous newspapers aimed at black leaders such as Bantu World, New Age, Indian Opinion. The article in Indian Opinion was written by Patrick Duncan. It's worthwhile mentioning that Patrick Duncan, 1918 to 1967, was a political thinker and activist who promoted human rights in South Africa and expressed concern regarding the relationship of humans with the earth. He was an anti-apartheid activist who, because of his support of universal suffrage, was harassed and imprisoned by the apartheid regime for his dissident activities. The most significant thing was that he was son of Sir Patrick Duncan, who had been Governor-General of South Africa 1937 to 1943, and so he was quite a high-profile individual. Organisations meeting around that time also passed resolutions demanding that the government issue Stephen with a passport. Two of these were the Federation of South African Women and the Mothers' Congress, both of whom were involved in the famous Women's Day March on the Union Building in August 1955. The African National Congress Youth League, not yet a banned organisation, also passed a motion demanding that Stephen be issued with a passport. Besides the political events and ramification on the issue of Stephen's passport, the most important thing obtained from the file, from the archives, was the date of birth of Stephen, and also the name of Stephen's father. Now, if you remember, I said I had found a death registration of a Stephen Gustav Lulu Ramasodi, whose 13-digit ID number tells us that he was born on the 9th of August 1938. A report from the Department of Native Affairs dated June 55 says he was 16 years old, so born sometime between June 1938 and June 1939. However, in a memo attached from the Department of Native Affairs, it says he was born on the 9th of August 1939, and his father was Philip E. Ramasodi, principal of J.J. de Jong Primary School in Attridgeville, Pretoria. Although the days match, 9th of August, the two references are a year out. How many Stephen Ramasodis are there in South Africa that could have been born on the same date but exactly a year apart? So for the moment, I took for granted that Stephen Ramasodi with Stephen Gustav Ramasodi were one and the same person. My task now was to find out what he did between 1955 and his death in 2000. The Wits University Archives have the Alan Paton papers. He received quite a few letters from his friend Father Trevor Huddleston, many containing references to Stephen Ramasodi. Although naming him simply as Stephen, we can see from the context that it was Stephen Ramasodi. In February 1956, Father Trevor was recalled by his order to the UK, and in letters to Alan Paton in December 1955 and February 1956, he expressed how much he was going to miss South Africa and how the UK held nothing for him. In a letter dated the 18th of June 1956, he thanked Alan Paton for hosting Stephen and some other schoolboys. Quote, "Thank you tremendously for inviting David, Stephen and co to your home twice. Two of those have already written to say how greatly they enjoyed and appreciated their afternoon." But further down the letter, he says, "I had a very pathetic letter from Stephen a day or two ago saying how hard it was finding his studies, because his memory is so bad as a result of the shock treatment. I wrote immediately to encourage him, and also to the principal urging him or her to encourage Stephen also. And that is all I can do except pray." When I first saw this letter, I was shocked, thinking that maybe Stephen had been held by the police and tortured at some stage. But I went back to Father Trevor Huddleston's book, Naught for Your Comfort, where he tells the whole story of Stephen's application for and rejection of the passport. Here is what Father Trevor wrote. "At the same time, Stephen had to go to hospital for a minor operation. I had a letter from him written just after the operation. The anaesthetic had somehow gone wrong. There'd been a crisis, and oxygen was necessary to get him round. They told me," he wrote, "that I nearly died, but of course I knew I would not die. God could not possibly disappoint me about America." God could not, writes Huddleston. Dr. Verwoerd could and did. I encourage you to read Father Trevor's book for the whole story from Father Trevor's point of view. But at this point, this is all I had on Stephen. Firstly, he was born 9th of August 1938 or 1939. I needed a baptism record to confirm which. Unfortunately, I have not found this. His parents were Philip Erastus Ramasodi and Sani Otelidi Boyankayo, who were married in the Lutheran Church in Bethany, Rustenburg on the 5th of July 1928. This information I obtained from the Native Affairs report on Stephen's parents and further searches on familysearch.org. His father was principal of J.J. de Jong Primary School in Attridgeville, Pretoria. He'd been trained at the Anglican-run Teachers Training College, Grace Deur, outside Petersburg, now Polokwane. He had served schools in Pretoria and was on the board of his former training college, so obviously a good, faithful Anglican. No record of his death found, but Sani Mayabela Ramasodi, born 1908, which matches Stephen's mother's date of birth, died in 1995. 1954, Stephen started attending St. Peter's Senior School in Rosettenville and later appears to have gone to a school in Natal where he matriculated. He had an operation where he required shock treatment to resuscitate him. Gen Database had a record of Stephen Gustav Lulu Ramasodi marrying on the 27th of July 1966 Mosele Ellen Motlongong. Unfortunately, no place of marriage is given. Gen Database also had two occupations listed on the death notification page. The first merely said Credit Card Division Garankula, Bophuthatswana. The second said Northwest Province Administration. As the Northwest Province is administrated from Mbabatu, I presume that was his occupation when he died, age 62. I went back to the death notification on Genderbase and reread it and saw that they gave Stephen Gustav Lulu Ramasodi's address as PO Box 4198 Mbabatu. I wondered if that would give us his employment or his home address. So I entered the PO Box number into Google. The Google search result came up with one. It was a website where those seeking employment could put their CV and other information. And this particular entry said, Attorney Lecturer Resume, Johannesburg, Gauteng. Clicking on it, it gave me the attorney's CV, but no way of contacting the person directly except through the website. But what was interesting was the name at the top of the CV. Surname Ramasodi, first name Olabocheng. ID number starting 930. It's the same surname. And so I sent an email, and Ole Ramasodi kindly phoned me. She told me that Stephen was her grandfather, and she was only 7 when he died, but he and his wife looked after her while her parents went to work. I asked her what her grandfather had done post-1955. She didn't really know, but she said that her grandmother, Mosele Ellen, was still alive and living in Mbabatu. And next time she visits, she would ask. I received no further correspondence from her in spite of sending a reminder. She said she hadn't had a chance to go home yet. I decided not to continue stalking her and passed on her information to Larry Gill in New York. He told me later that he too had phoned her and had a long and interesting conversation. She was busy studying for her articles in the legal field, and so had been busy, but would come back to him once she'd gone home. Larry told her that her grandfather had been internationally famous, with articles about the refusal to issue him with a passport appearing in the New York Times, Time magazine and Life magazine, as well as the local papers that I'd found at Wits University archives. She was amazed and is quite keen to hear more about her grandfather. That is as far as I've got in finding Stephen Ramasodi. I just hope that Larry Gill will follow it up and keep me informed on any feedback from Stephen's granddaughter, Ole. As I said at the beginning, this is the first time I've had to search for a black South African family. In the past, I remember seeing emails from people who had transcribed some baptism registers. They gave all the white people's names and ended by saying the rest of the page were black families. I'm pleased that Family Search, Gen Database and other genealogical sites do index all South Africans, and we can find black South African families on the same genealogical websites as white South Africans. Kent School viewed Stephen Ramasodi as the friend we never knew. I'm also pleased that we can remember Stephen Ramasodi as the friend we never met, but now know more about.